The steam from the locomotive hissed violently against the dry spring air, creating a curtain of white mist that momentarily obscured the platform of the dusty station. Gideon Thorne shifted his weight from one boot to the other, the leather creaking in the silence that followed the train's arrival. He adjusted the collar of his coat, feeling the grit of the frontier settling into the fabric, a constant reminder of the land he worked and the life he was trying to build. He had not come to town for supplies or to trade cattle. He had come for a wife. The correspondence had been brief, practical, and devoid of romance, arranged through a broker in San Francisco who promised a woman of steady character and simple needs. Gideon was a man who understood the language of labor and endurance, and he expected a partner who viewed marriage through the same pragmatic lens. The passengers began to disembark, a stream of weary travelers stepping down onto the wooden planks, their faces obscured by hats and the lingering smoke. Gideon scanned the crowd, looking for a woman who matched the vague description he had been given. Someone plain, sturdy, likely wearing the calico or wool common to the women of the territory. The crowd thinned, the noise of reunions and baggage handling fading until only a few figures remained. Gideon's brow furrowed, a seed of doubt taking root in his chest as he wondered if there had been a mistake, or if she had simply lost her nerve before the final stop. Then, through the dissipating steam, a figure stepped forward, and the breath caught in Gideon's throat, not from recognition, but from sheer incongruity. She was not wearing the heavy skirts or bonnets of the local women. Instead, she was clad in a traditional cheongsam of pale beige silk, the high collar fastening at her throat, the fabric falling in clean, straight lines that defied the dust swirling around her ankles. She stood with a stillness that seemed to separate her from the chaotic movement of the station, her hands clasped before her, clutching a small, battered valise. Gideon stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the image before him with the expectation he had carried for weeks. He took a hesitant step forward, unsure if he should speak or turn away, assuming this elegant foreign woman was waiting for someone entirely different, someone who belonged to a world far softer than his ranch. She saw him move. Her eyes, dark and assessing, locked onto his face with a terrifying precision. There was no hesitation in her posture as she walked toward him, the beige fabric of her dress shimmering slightly in the harsh afternoon sun. She stopped 3 feet away, close enough for him to smell a faint trace of jasmine that seemed impossible in this land of sagebrush and sweat. Without a word, she reached into the sleeve of her dress and withdrew a small rectangular object. She held it out to him. Gideon looked down to see a photograph, a tintype of himself, taken 2 years ago, the one he had sent to the broker with his initial letter. The man in the picture looked younger, less weathered, but the eyes were the same. He looked from the photograph back to the woman, the reality of the situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. This was the arrangement. This was the woman who had traveled across an ocean and a continent to stand on this platform. "I am Gideon," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, the words feeling clumsy in the open air. She nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. "I am May," she replied, her voice quiet but clear, carrying an accent that softened the edges of the name. She did not smile, and she did not offer a hand to shake. She simply waited, her gaze steady, challenging him to accept the reality she presented. The journey back to the homestead was defined by the silence that stretched between them, vast and imposing as the open plains. Gideon sat high on the bench of the buckboard wagon, the leather reins loose in his calloused hands, while May sat beside him, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The landscape of the territory was not kind to strangers. It was a sprawling canvas of scrub brush, rocky outcroppings, and a sky so wide it could make a man feel insignificant. He wondered what she saw as she looked out at the endless brown and gold. Did she see opportunity, or did she see a prison? He stole glances at her, noting the way she held herself against the swaying of the wagon. She did not complain about the heat, which was already rising despite the early spring date. Nor did she flinch at the dust kicked up by the horses' hooves. The beige Cheong Sam, so pristine at the station, was beginning to collect the inevitable powder of the trail, but she made no move to brush it away. It was as if she understood that to fight the dust here was a losing battle, a lesson it had taken Gideon years to learn. Gideon felt a gnawing anxiety in his gut. He had prepared his home for a woman who could churn butter, mend heavy canvas, and help birth calves in the freezing mud. He looked at May's hands resting on her lap. They were slender, the fingers long and tapered, looking more suited to holding a paintbrush or a needle of the finest silk than a skinning knife. He had made a promise, signed a contract, and given his word, but the practicality that governed his life screamed that this was a mistake. How would she survive here? The ranch was miles from the nearest neighbor. The isolation broke men, let alone a woman who looked like she belonged in a city of lanterns and stone streets. "It's not much further," Gideon said, breaking the silence, compelled to offer some assurance, however hollow. "The house is sturdy. It keeps the wind out." May turned her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "The wind is not what I fear," she said. Her words were sparse, chosen with care, and they hung in the air long after she spoke. Gideon tightened his grip on the reins, urging the horses forward. He did not ask what she feared. He wasn't sure he wanted to know, because he suspected her fears were different from his own, born of a history he couldn't begin to guess at. They crested the final ridge as the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The ranch sat in the valley below, a collection of rough-hewn timber buildings that looked small against the backdrop of the mountains. The main house was a simple structure, built for utility, with a wide porch and a stone chimney that breathed a thin line of smoke into the cooling air. Gideon watched her face for a reaction, disappointment, fear, disgust, but she gave him nothing. She simply observed, her eyes tracing the lines of the fences, the location of the well, the barn where the livestock waited. When he pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the porch, the silence returned, heavier now with the weight of arrival. This was it. There was no going back to the station, no undoing the miles they had crossed. Gideon climbed down and walked around to her side, offering his hand to help her descend. She looked at his hand for a moment, then up at his eyes, before placing her fingers in his palm. Her grip was surprisingly firm, lacking the tremor he expected. As she stepped onto the dirt of his home, the beige silk of her dress brushed against his dusty boots, a stark contrast of worlds colliding. The interior of the house was dim, the light fading quickly as evening set in. Gideon moved to light the kerosene lamp on the central table, the glass chimney clinking softly as he adjusted the wick. The golden glow illuminated the main room, revealing the sparse, masculine nature of his existence. A heavy oak table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that doubled for heating and cooking, and a few shelves cluttered with tools and tin goods. There were no curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floorboards, no softness anywhere. Gideon felt a sudden, sharp spike of embarrassment. He had not seen his home through the eyes of another in years, and now, under May's gaze, it looked barren and cold. He watched as she placed her valise on the floor, her movements silent. She turned in a slow circle, taking in the rough timber walls, the shadows in the corners, the layer of dust that seemed to regenerate no matter how often he swept. "It's simple," Gideon said, the word tasting like an apology he didn't want to make. "I spend most of my time outdoors." May walked to the stove, running a finger along the cold iron edge. She inspected the soot on her fingertip before wiping it away on a handkerchief she produced from her sleeve. "A house reflects the mind of the keeper," she said softly, not looking at him. "This is a mind of work, of survival." She turned to face him, the lamp casting long shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones. "I am not afraid of work, Gideon." It was the first time she had used his name since the station, and it sounded different in the intimacy of the cabin. "But we will need order." She did not wait for his permission. She began to unpack her valise, not revealing frivolous trinkets, but practical items. A small pouch of tea, a wrapped bundle of utensils that looked foreign to his eyes, and a folded piece of thick, embroidered fabric. She moved with an economy of motion that mesmerized him. She was not asking to be served. She was claiming the space. Gideon stood by the door, feeling like a guest in his own home. He realized then that he had expected a woman who would need to be taught everything: how to light the stove, how to draw water, how to survive. Instead, he had brought a woman who seemed to be assessing whether he was capable of surviving alongside her. He cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. "I'll see to the horses," he said, needing to escape the sudden compression of the atmosphere. "There's wood by the back door." May nodded, already busy arranging her few possessions on the shelf he had cleared. "Go," she said, without turning around. "The animals must eat." Gideon stepped out into the night, the cool air hitting his face, his heart pounding a rhythm that felt dangerously like hope mixed with dread. The next morning broke with a deceptive calm, the sun bleeding over the mountains to illuminate the frost that still clung to the shadows. Gideon had woken before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of solitude, but when he emerged from the small sleeping loft, he found the main room transformed. The air, usually stale with the smell of old wood smoke and dry leather, carried a faint, clean scent of boiling water and something herbal. May was already awake. She had not changed her clothes. He realized with a start that she likely had very few garments, but the beige cheongsam looked immaculate, as if the dust of the previous day had simply refused to stick to her. She was standing by the stove, stirring a pot with a wooden spoon he didn't recognize. The table was set, not with his tin plates thrown carelessly down, but with the ceramic bowls she must have brought in her valise, arranged with precise symmetry. "Morning," Gideon grunted, the word rough in his throat. He felt large and clumsy in the space, his boots loud on the floorboards. May turned, her expression composed. "Sit," she said. It wasn't a command, but it wasn't a request either. It was a statement of fact. Gideon sat. He watched as she ladled a thin porridge into the bowls. It wasn't the heavy bacon and biscuits he was used to, and his stomach rumbled in protest, but he said nothing. She placed the bowl before him, then a cup of tea that steamed in the morning light. "Eat," she said, sitting opposite him. She ate with small, disciplined movements, her back straight, never slouching against the chair. Gideon took a spoonful, the taste bland but warming. He watched her over the rim of the bowl. "I have work on the south fence today," he said, feeling the need to justify his existence. "Winter knocked a section down. Cattle will wander if I don't fix it." May lowered her spoon. "I will clean the house," she said. "The dust is heavy." Gideon bristled slightly. "It's a ranch, May. Dust is part of the deal." She looked at him, her eyes dark and unyielding. "Dirt is part of the land. Filth is a choice." The rebuke was delivered so calmly that it took a moment to register. Gideon stared at her, half tempted to argue, to tell her that out here survival took precedence over sweeping. But he looked around the room, seeing the grime he had ignored for years, the chaotic clutter of his life. He looked back at her, seeing the dignity she maintained in the middle of nowhere, wearing a dress that belonged in a palace, drinking tea from a ceramic cup she had carried across an ocean. He realized she wasn't judging him. She was setting a standard. "Right," he said, looking down at his porridge. "Do what you see fit." He finished his meal quickly, eager to get out to the familiarity of the fence line and the physical labor that made sense to him, leaving her to the war she had declared on his domestic chaos. By midday, the sky had turned a bruising shade of slate, the wind picking up and whipping the sagebrush into a frenzy. Gideon was miles from the house, wrestling with a cedar post that refused to seat properly in the rocky soil. His hands were raw, his muscles aching, but the physical pain was a grounding force. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow, looking toward the mountains. The weather was turning. Spring in the territory was violent and unpredictable. A sunny morning could turn into a hailstorm by afternoon. He secured the post with a few heavy strikes of the sledgehammer and decided to head back. The cattle were skittish, sensing the pressure drop, and he needed to make sure the barn doors were secured before the wind really hit. When he rode into the yard, the first fat drops of rain were beginning to crater the dust. He dismounted quickly, leading his horse into the barn. The interior was dark and smelled of hay and manure. He moved to the stall of the mare that was close to foaling, checking her condition. She was restless, shifting her weight, her eyes wide with anxiety. Gideon murmured to her, stroking her neck, but his attention was pulled to the barn entrance. May stood there, framed by the gray light of the storm. She had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, but the wind whipped the hem of her beige dress around her legs. "The sky is angry," she said, her voice cutting through the rising wind. "The shutters on the house are loose." "I'll fix them," Gideon said, moving to exit the barn. "Go back inside." "No," she said, stepping further into the barn. "The horse. She is in pain." Gideon stopped. He looked back at the mare, then at May. "She's just nervous about the storm." "No," May repeated, walking past him toward the stall. She moved without fear, approaching the large animal with a calmness that baffled him. She reached out, her hand hovering near the mare's flank. "She is hot. Fever." Gideon frowned, stepping closer. He placed his hand on the mare's neck. May was right. The animal was burning up. Panic flared in his chest. A sick horse could mean the difference between a profitable season and ruin. "I need to get the poultice," he muttered, turning to the tack room. "Hot water," May ordered, "and clean cloths." Gideon hesitated. "I can handle it." "She needs help now," May said, her eyes flashing. "Do not be foolish with pride." The storm broke with a fury that shook the timbers of the barn. Rain hammered against the roof like buckshot. Inside, the lantern cast long, dancing shadows as Gideon and May worked side by side. The mare was thrashing now, the fever and the early labor pains creating a dangerous combination. Gideon struggled to keep the animal calm, his weight thrown against her shoulder to keep her from collapsing against the stall wall. May was at the mare's flank, her beige cheongsam stained with straw and water, but she didn't seem to care. She had prepared a mixture of herbs she had brought from the house, things Gideon couldn't name, and was applying them with steady, rhythmic movements. "Hold her steady," May commanded, her voice steel. She wasn't the delicate ornament he had seen at the station. She was a force. Gideon gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as the horse bucked. "She's fighting it," he yelled over the thunder. "She knows you are afraid," May said, her hands moving confidently. "Calm your heart, Gideon. She feels you." The instruction hit him hard. He took a deep breath, forcing his own anxiety down, willing his body to relax even as he held the weight. The mare responded, her movements slowing, her breathing hitching but becoming less frantic. May worked for another hour, murmuring in a language Gideon didn't understand, a low, melodic sound that seemed to weave through the noise of the storm. Finally, the mare slumped, exhausted but stable. The fever seemed to have broken, or at least receded enough for her to rest. Gideon slid down the wall of the stall, sitting in the straw, his chest heaving. He looked across at May. She was kneeling, wiping her hands on a rag. Her hair had come loose from its pin, strands falling across her face. The hem of her dress was ruined with mud and muck. She looked up and their eyes met. There was no triumph in her gaze, only the shared exhaustion of the battle. "She will live," May said quietly. "But the foal, we must wait." Gideon nodded, unable to find the words. He had expected her to cower during the storm. He had expected her to be useless. Instead, she had saved his horse when he had missed the signs. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice raspy. May looked down at her hands. "Survival takes many forms, Gideon. I learned what was necessary." The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and wet. Night had fallen completely. They walked back to the house in the mud, the air cold and crisp. Inside, the fire in the stove had burned down to embers. Gideon added wood, the flames catching and casting a warm glow over the room. He felt a strange shift in the atmosphere. The awkwardness of the previous day was gone, replaced by a quiet, vibrating tension that came from shared danger. May moved to the basin to wash, scrubbing her arms with the rough soap. Gideon watched her, seeing the strength in her back, the way she stood. She wasn't just a bride he had bought. She was a partner he hadn't earned yet. He heated a pot of stew, the simple food smelling better than anything he could remember. They sat at the table, the lantern light flickering between them. They ate in silence, but it was a companionable silence. When they finished, Gideon pushed his bowl away. "Thank you," he said. The words were heavy, meaningful. "For the mare. I might have lost her." May looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "We do not lose what we fight for," she said. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the darkness where the ranch lay hidden. "But the fighting is not over. The land, it demands much." Gideon stood as well, moving to stand a few feet behind her. He could see her reflection in the glass, the beige of her dress, a ghost against the black night. He wanted to reach out, to touch her shoulder, to bridge the gap, but he held back. The distance between them had shrunk, but it was still there, filled with unanswered questions and the weight of the unknown. "We'll manage," Gideon said, and for the first time he almost believed it. May didn't turn, but her head tilted slightly, acknowledging his words. Outside, the wind began to rise again, a low moan that promised the spring was far from finished with them. The days following the storm bled into a rhythm that Gideon had not anticipated, a cadence dictated not just by the sun and the cattle, but by the quiet, persistent presence of May. The mare, having survived the fever, finally went into true labor 3 nights later, the event pulling both of them from their beds into the cool, hay-scented dark of the barn. There was no desperate scrambling this time, only a hushed, reverent vigilance as they watched the cycle of life unfold in the straw. Gideon held the lantern high, the kerosene flame casting a warm, amber sphere around them, while May knelt near the mare's head, whispering those same unintelligible, soothing words that seemed to bridge the gap between human and beast. When the foal finally slipped into the world, wet and trembling, a collective breath seemed to leave the room. Gideon watched as May reached out to clear the membrane from the foal's nose, her hands gentle and unhesitating, the beige silk of her sleeve rolled up to her elbow, revealing pale skin that looked too delicate for this harsh work, yet moved with undeniable strength. The sight of her there, coaxing life from the precipice of death, stirred something in Gideon's chest that felt dangerously like affection. It was a physical ache, a tightness in his throat that he couldn't swallow away. He lowered the lantern and sat beside her in the straw, the distance between their bodies shrinking until the warmth radiating from her arm brushed against his own. "It's a filly," he murmured, his voice cracking with exhaustion. May looked at him, her eyes shining with fatigue and triumph, and for the first time the corner of her mouth lifted in a genuine ghost of a smile. "She is strong," May whispered, "like the land." In that moment, surrounded by the smell of birth and the sounds of the night, Gideon felt the walls of his solitude crumbling. He reached out, his rough, calloused hand covering hers where it rested on her knee. She did not pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. a silent pact forged in the shadows of a barn at the edge of the world. They sat there until dawn painted the sky in streaks of violet, neither willing to break the contact, the silence between them no longer empty, but full of a terrifying, wonderful promise. Spring in the territory was not a season of leisure. It was a violent awakening, and the peace of the barn was quickly shattered by the demands of the open range. The grass was coming in green and thick, but with the new growth came the predators, the wolves and coyotes drawn down from the foothills by the scent of newborn calves. Gideon spent his days in the saddle, riding the perimeter, his rifle scabbard always within reach. He had expected May to stay close to the house, to tend to the garden she had started to carve out of the hard-packed earth, but she surprised him again. One afternoon, as he was cinching the saddle on his gelding, she appeared at the barn door, wearing a pair of his old trousers she had cut and hemmed to fit her slender frame, a wide-brimmed hat obscuring her eyes. "I will ride with you," she stated, her tone leaving no room for argument. Gideon looked at her, taking in the strange sight of this woman who carried herself like an empress, wearing the clothes of a ranch hand. "It's dangerous, May. The wolves are bold this year." She walked past him to the roan mare, the one she had saved, which was now recovering well enough for light work. "The danger is shared, Gideon. So is the work." They rode out together, the silence of the plains broken only by the steady rhythm of hooves and the wind hissing through the sage. He watched her ride. She sat a horse with a natural grace, her balance intuitive. When they found the break in the north fence, the wire snapped by a spooked herd, they worked in tandem to repair it. Gideon strained against the tension of the wire, his muscles burning, while May hammered the staples with a focused intensity. As they worked, a shadow detached itself from the brush, a coyote, gaunt and desperate, eyeing the calves grazing nearby. Gideon reached for his rifle, but before he could level it, a sharp crack echoed across the gully. May stood there, a small revolver he hadn't known she possessed, smoking in her hand, the coyote kicking up dust as it fled, a warning shot placed with surgical precision near its paws. Gideon stared at her, the rifle forgotten in his hands. She holstered the weapon in a makeshift belt, her expression calm. "In San Francisco," she said, answering his unasked question, "a woman alone must be prepared." Gideon felt a rush of adrenaline that had nothing to do with the threat. He walked to her, the vastness of the sky bearing down on them, and placed his hands on her shoulders. "You are full of surprises, May." She looked up at him, the brim of her hat tilting back, and the intensity in her gaze stopped his heart. "And you, Gideon," she replied softly, "are beginning to see me." The evenings became their sanctuary, a time when the harshness of the labor faded into the soft glow of the oil lamp. The house, once a testament to bachelor neglect, had softened under her touch. There were curtains now, stitched from flour sacks but dyed with berries to a warm russet hue, and the smell of sage and wild onion always hung in the air. One night, after a dinner of stew that tasted far better than anything Gideon had ever cooked, they sat by the fire, the wind howling impotently outside. May was mending a tear in his coat, her needle flashing in the light, while Gideon cleaned his gun, the smell of oil and solvent mixing with the wood smoke. He watched her hands, mesmerized by their dexterity. "Why did you come?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could check it. It was the question that had haunted him since the station. "You could have stayed in the city. You have skills. You are—" he struggled for the word. "Refined." May paused, the needle hovering over the fabric. She didn't look up immediately. "Refinement does not fill the spirit, Gideon. The city is a cage of noise and expectations." She looked at him then, her eyes dark and reflecting the flames. "I wanted silence. I wanted to see if I could stand on earth that did not belong to another man." She resumed her stitching, her voice dropping lower. "And I wanted to know if there was a man who wanted a partner, not a servant. Gideon set the gun down, the metal clinking softly on the table. He felt exposed, stripped of his usual defenses. "I didn't think I wanted a partner," he admitted, his voice rough. "I thought I just needed help, someone to keep the silence from driving me mad." He stood up and moved to where she sat, kneeling so he was eye level with her. "But now, I don't know how I stood the silence before you." May stopped sewing. She reached out, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, the touch feather light but searing. "We build a new noise," she whispered, "a quiet noise, of two lives becoming one." Gideon leaned into her touch, closing his eyes, surrendering to the tenderness he had denied himself for so long. He turned his face into her palm, pressing a kiss to the center of her hand, a gesture of reverence and need that spoke louder than any declaration. The fragility of their newfound peace was tested a week later, not by the land, but by the inevitable failure of flesh and bone. They were repairing the roof of the hay barn, a task long overdue. Gideon was high on the pitch, wrestling with a warped shingle, when the rotted beam beneath him gave way with a sickening crack. There was no time to react, no time to shout. The world spun and the ground rushed up to meet him with brutal force. He landed hard on his side, the breath driven from his lungs, a sharp, white-hot agony exploding in his leg. The world went gray at the edges. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard a scream, not his own, but May's. She was at his side in seconds, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror he had never seen there before. "Gideon!" She was touching his face, his chest, checking for life. He tried to move, but the pain in his leg anchored him to the earth. "Leg," he gritted out, the word a gasp. May looked down, her hands hovering over the unnatural angle of his shin. She didn't faint. She didn't weep. The panic in her eyes hardened into resolve. "Do not move," she commanded, her voice shaking but firm. She ran to the house, returning moments later with splints and bandages. The setting of the bone was a blur of torture, a pain so intense Gideon nearly blacked out. But through the haze he felt her hands, steady, strong, anchoring him. She dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, into the house and onto the bed he had slept in alone for years. That night, as the fever of trauma set in, he drifted in and out of consciousness. Every time he surfaced, she was there. She was wiping his brow with cool cloths, holding a cup of water to his cracked lips, whispering to him in her language. In the delirium of the fever, he saw her not as a stranger, but as the only thing holding him to the earth. "Don't go," he mumbled, gripping her wrist with weak fingers. "I'm here," she promised, her voice a balm in the darkness. "I am not going anywhere, Gideon. I am here." Recovery was a slow, humiliating process for a man used to the autonomy of strength. For weeks, Gideon was confined to the house, watching the season turn from the wet gray of spring to the golden heat of early summer through the window. But in that confinement, the nature of their bond shifted irrevocably. He was forced to rely on her for everything, and she gave her care without a hint of resentment. She ran the ranch, managing the cattle, chopping the wood, and returning to him in the evenings with the scent of the sun on her skin. One evening, as he sat on the porch, his leg propped up, watching the sunset bleed across the western sky, May came out to join him. She carried 2 cups of tea, the steam rising in the cooling air. She handed him one and sat on the step below him, leaning her back against his good leg. It was a casual intimacy that spoke of 1,000 small moments of trust earned through hardship. Gideon looked down at the top of her head, the black hair gleaming in the twilight. He realized that the photograph he had sent, the letters, the contract, they were all ashes now. What remained was this: the woman who had saved his horse, fought off wolves, and mended his broken body. "You saved me," he said quietly, the words feeling inadequate. May turned her head to look up at him, her profile sharp against the horizon. "We save each other," she corrected him gentle. "That is the way of this place." Gideon reached down, cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing the soft skin beneath her eye. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life, May. But before that, you saved my soul." He leaned down, and she rose to meet him, their lips meeting in a kiss that was not tentative, but deep and grounded, tasting of tea and dust and a love that had been forged in the fires of survival. It was a quiet affirmation, a seal on a bond that no longer needed words. The sun dipped below the mountains, casting the world in shadow, but on the porch, in the circle of their arms, there was only light. They sat together in the gathering dark, watching the stars emerge one by one, two solitary figures who had found a way to be alone together.